Welcome. Welcome to our vibrant community of MoMA members and donors. We're so glad that you're here with us tonight. And as always, we appreciate your support. And this is an expressive night, so big heart to you. I'm Paola Antonelli, Senior Curator here at MoMA of Architecture and Design, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion, which is based on the documentary, The Emoji Story. I hope you have had a chance to see it, but if not, it's being screened right now on the MoMA website. And tonight, we're joined here by the documentary's producer, Jennifer A. Lee, and my beloved colleague, collection specialist, Paul Galloway from the Museum of Modern Art's Department of Architecture and Design. So the Emoji Story is available to stream on MoMA Magazine until Tuesday, March 2nd. And we'll share the link in the chat so you'll be able to watch it after our conversation tonight if you haven't seen it already. So a few details for you. Please note that the automated captioning is integrated through Zoom for hearing accessibility. And to access it, you have to go to CC Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen, and then you have to click Show Subtitle. And please use the Q&A feature to ask questions and click all panelists and attendees, so we'll get your questions and we'll answer them at some point of the night. Using the chat feature also to share your observations with the audience here tonight, or even to request technical assistance. So without further adu, please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Paul. So first of all, Jennifer, okay, Jenny, here you are. And here is Paul. So Jenny, I met Jenny quite a few years ago at a fabulous unconference that I want to mention here because hopefully some of our friends are watching, which was called Spark Camp. It was a wonderful conference for journalists and designers, and it was like a wonderful collection of people. Many of them odd birds that didn't really fit in their categories, and that's why they were there. And Jenny was one of them. Jenny is a quite special individual. She's a journalist, I guess. That's like how you would call her normally, but she's also a movie producer, as you know well, and also an emoji activist, amongst other characteristics. So in 2016, together with her colleague Yiying Lu, her friend Yiying Lu, she was responsible for getting the dumpling emoji accepted by Unicode. And on the enthusiasm from that victory came the founding of Emoji Nation, which is basically an activist society that wants to make emoji for the people. So they were responsible for getting the bagel emoji accepted, the lobster, and that's a funny thing. If you watch the documentary, you're going to have a laugh at that, and the hijab. And so, I mean, tonight she's going to tell us about her experience with emoji and what emojis mean to her, because activism through emoji is something that we really need to understand better because it's another weapon for us to use. Paul Galloway, what can I say? We've been working together for so many years, another really odd bird and a special one at that. So his official title is collection specialist. He's also an artist, a really passionate educator, a father, but that's another matter. And he is one of the best advocates for all the weirdest ideas that I can possibly come up with for the collection. So we've gone through quite a few adventures together. We have collected together 20 plus video games, and we had to really go to bat for that, the @sign, you name it. So two wonderful people to speak with tonight. So some of you have not seen the documentary yet. So Jenny, would you please succinctly describe the content of the documentary for our audience?
Yeah, so the emoji documentary that I produced, which is called The Emoji Story, is actually about sort of the inner workings of the Unicode Consortium and sort of they are the secret regulatory body which oversees emoji. And what we basically do is we follow a bunch of people from around the world who are very passionate about a series of emoji. One is the hijab emoji, one is the mate emoji, a group of folks from Argentina. And then one is also yes, and another one is a nonprofit group in the UK, which is a which wants a menstruation or a period emoji. And so what happens then
I'm
is
gonna ask I'm gonna ask Stephen to bring up the slide, you know, perfect, thank you.
So essentially these are, we follow the journeys of these folks, and then just sort of like the highs and lows of kind of getting your emoji produced by Unicode. And this also sort of trails my own journey with Emoji Nation, where we're trying to get more representative and inclusive emoji. Our motto is emoji by the people for the people. And so it was you know, this journey with the documentary also started at the same time that my journey, you know, down the emoji rabbit hole as an activist started. So they kind of overlap with each other. And then somewhere along the line, I ended up in one of the vice chairs of the Unicode Emoji Subcommittee. So I started from outside of the consortium, which is dominated by large US multinational tech companies. And I brought sort of the voices of people into the room, and now literally into the Zoom, advocating for kind of emoji that represent the world.
That's so interesting. So you were fighting for a particular emoji tonight before coming onto the Zoom?
A couple of weeks ago, yes. I mean, we actually have 2-hour meetings. Sorry, we have 2 1-hour meetings every week, one on Tuesday and one on Thursday, all about emoji regulation. This is like one of the most busy, inclusive, like extracurriculars I've ever done. It started it's basically an extracurricular run amok, as I like to say.
Well, I'm going to weave the two narratives together. So now we heard a little bit about the documentary. Now, why are you talking with us? Well, because when we met, you were starting Emoji Nation, and I was tackling the acquisition of the first set of emojis by Shigetaka Kurita in 1999 emojis. Together with Paul. Actually, Paul was the engine of the acquisition. So Paul, would you be so kind as to narrate for our audience the acquisition of the emojis? And maybe, Stephen, could you bring up the first slide of the installation in the lobby?
So it's been a really fascinating, as Paola has alluded, she is constantly throwing me wacky curveballs from the most bizarre locations of the creative world imaginable. And I feel like I have to remake my job every time she throws me one of these things. And emoji was a particularly challenging and interesting one because it's one of the most perfect examples of some of the hidden infrastructure of the internet that we all just take for granted. But there's actually a really fascinating story behind it, and where does it begin, and what time context is it sort of situated in? And so it involved some research with Paola and Michelle Fisher, our beloved colleague, and myself figuring out where does emoji begin, and that story takes us to Japan in the late 1990s, to actually talking to the company, NTT Docomo, which is, I always equate it to the Verizon Wireless of Japan. It's a gigantic telecom company with fingers in many different kind of industries. And we had to figure out a way to acquire something that is obsolete, right? Because it is no longer used in this form. Emoji are very different than they were in the late 90s. And also, what does it mean to own them? So it raised all kinds of legal questions, philosophical questions, why are we even doing this kind of questions, and what would we do with them at the museum, which then is always fun to kind of picture what Paola or other curators might do with these things in the museum. And it was fascinating. It took us down legal rabbit holes and conceptual rabbit holes, and it took us a good 1.5 years to negotiate with Docomo. But I have to say they were wonderful partners in the end. They were very accommodating and passionate about this as well, and have been great partners ever since we started this.
And Shigetaka Kurita, the original designer from the set, the 1999 set, came to the museum, and he was super happy. And actually, in the documentary, you can see Paul, and Shigetaka at the museum. It was quite beautiful and moving, because one thing that Paul and I encounter often is that when we show something at the museum that nobody expected would be there, there's such emotion on the side of not only the designers, but also the manufacturers, producers, lawyers, you name it, that it's quite wonderful. So here we go. Activism on one side, museum and curatorial practice on the other, both concentrating and focusing on the emojis. So Jenny, in the documentary, you talk about Katrina Parrott, and you also interview Katrina
Mhm.
Parrott, and you just told me that something really exciting is happening with the Smithsonian Museum of African American
Maybe.
History and Culture. So, would you mind talking about this amazing
Katrina.
moment of Katrina
Yeah.
Parrott's proposal?
Yeah, so I just want to give a shout out to Katrina Parrott, who I think is one of the most underheralded people in terms of impact on emoji. She's an entrepreneur and mother from Houston, who is actually, I would say, single-handedly and or the catalyst for the fact that we have skin tone emojis. So, once upon a time when emoji first landed, on our like kind of non-Japan devices, they were all yellow, right? So all the humans were yellow, the families were yellow, Santa Claus was yellow, even the man from India was yellow. I mean, they just had like one skin tone, which was yellow, which was meant to be actually no skin tone, right? The idea was like no one is actually really yellow, so it's supposed to represent like generic people. And it's interesting because Apple chose yellow as a skin tone, but I think Microsoft's original emoji were gray, and they're actually quite hideous and a little bit have this like monster underneath the bed vibe, because they also have these like pointy ears. So that was their version of not choosing a skin tone. So, but obviously a lot of people interpret yellow in sort of the Simpson sense, which is that it is sort of like light skinned or Caucasian or white. And so Katrina had a teenage daughter who came home one day. This was, I think, 2013. Who was like, I'd really like an emoji that looked like me, and Katrina was like, that's great, honey. What's an emoji? Because she had no idea what an emoji kind of was. So it was back in 2013 where, some people used emoji, but it wasn't necessarily widespread. So with her daughter's desire in hand, she just basically hunted down the Unicode Consortium and proposed a system of 5 skin tones that we see now, which is sort of like a bit based on the Fitzpatrick's scale. So like Fitzpatrick 1 and 2 is the lightest one, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 each have their own. And that's actually really impressive, because at a certain point, the Unicode Consortium pushed back and said, what about just 3 skin tones? And she's like, no, there must be 5. And so there are now 5. And I would say, as a person who has impacted, she probably has impacted more human beings in some ways than many others, right? Because billions of people use all these additional skin tones, and we see them in all kinds of interesting ways. Like now there's like a black Santa Claus, and there is, I love the Black Mermaids, for example. And one of the things that we worked on was interracial couple of emoji, which was collected by the Smithsonian Superhewitt Museum. So the thing that we're hoping is that Katrina Parrott's work will be collected by the Smithsonian's African American Museum, National Museum of African American History and Culture. I think they're in that process, but as Paul said, the process of legally acquiring like emoji is complex, and there's a lot going on.
Now I have to say,
but I think MoMA blazed the trail. I think actually the fact that you guys are able to do it, I think inspired a lot of other museums out there.
No, but I think it definitely should be acquired. It's so deserving, because this is the quiet activism that is truly revolutionary, and that comes from a necessity that is intimate and at the same time completely global. So all of these articulation of emojis is also fascinating. And of course, it's enabled by progress in technology. But I would like to ask you, Paul, because you had quite a few conversations with Shigetaka, and he was so amazed because, at the beginning, there were 176 emoji. Today, as of September 2020, 3,521. So what did he tell you? What is his reaction to what's happened?
I think it's, years ago, Paola coined a wonderful phrase, the humble masterpiece, right? Which is about these kind of small little actions of design that have a really gigantic impact, often way beyond anything the designer actually intended. And I think what Shigetaka did at Docomo was a perfect example of that. And he will be the first to tell you that he didn't invent emoji, right? That emoji are part of a continuum from emoticons, smiley faces. Embellishing text with pictures has been around forever, but he created a system of designs that was the most successful of the early emoji in Japan in the late 1990s. And when I talked to him at the museum, he was bemused that something he created to solve a problem, right? Which is what design's function is to solve. You give a set of constraints and a problem to solve, and here is your solution to that. And if you look at that early set, there's only 5 faces. It's much more kind of informational graphics. So what happened with it was, I think, very surprising to him. But that's the kind of fascinating thing that happens when a designer or an artist makes something, and then it goes out into the world, and then the world does something completely different with it than they anticipated or intended. And one great anecdote he told me was, you know, there's one symbol that was really powerfully used a lot last year was the fist, right? Which was adopted by a lot of the protesters for the Black Lives Matter movement. And he told me that in that very small set of 176, he had the kind of cut one, he had the fist one, and he had the hand up. He'd initially thought of those as being rock, paper, scissors, not being,
oh my God.
not being peace and high and Black power. It was more like rock, paper, scissors, which it's just a perfect example of something, you know, a writer or any creative person cedes control over something once it goes out into the world. And I think he's just seen something that he thought would be used one way, just go in completely different directions, in a million different directions.
Well, it is indeed wonderful. And emojis become so personal, right? They really are identified. We all have our favorite emojis and they express ourselves. And that's what you were saying also, Jenny, about somebody feeling represented. That's what Katrina Parrott's daughter wanted. And in a way, that's truly also what the 3 stories in Emoji Story are about. We have Rayouf Ahumedhi, 15-year-old teenager, Saudi teenager living in Berlin. She wants the hijab emoji. And then we have Florencia Coelho in Buenos Aires. She wants the mate emoji because that's Argentinian identity. And last but not least, we have Plan International in the UK, a non-for-profit that works for girls, you know, to make girls feel more represented and safer in the world. And they want the menstruation emoji. It's all about making people feel represented. So what happens to these 3 stories and why?
So some of it's like drum roll, and not so surprising you see some of these emoji already on your phone. So the hijab emoji, that one's actually really fascinating because when I first joined the Unicode Consortium, I actually joined in part because of the dumpling, which, you know, I read a book on Chinese food, so I had a lot of moral authority about getting the dumpling emoji. And independently, before Rayouf even showed up on the scene, I had thought like, oh, it'd be really important and good to get a hijab emoji. And while I had a kind of a lot of moral authority with Chinese food and dumplings, I didn't feel like I was the right person to kind of propose the hijab emoji. And I actually kind of asked some friends and friends who had sisters or girlfriends if they knew anyone who would be willing to work on a proposal. But the thing about a Unicode proposal, it's so many steps and there's so much work and there's a lot of lot of back and forth. You really have to be passionate in order to get your emoji through. If you're like, it would be nice to have a baseball cap emoji, or it'd be nice to have, a pomegranate emoji. You're not going to have the sort of mission to get you through the bureaucracy like someone like Katrina Parrott did. So what happened was just in August of 2016, we get an email from, just sort of over the transfer from into the Unicode inbox, which is a pretty solid, but not perfect, but very good proposal from someone who wanted a hijab emoji. And it was you see a lot of mixed kind of not so great emojis. The proposals, this was a pretty good one. And I connected with her and said, I think I can help make this happen. So she actually, she was thrilled, right? Because it's you email this thing into the dark vortex. And I think even within a couple of days, maybe even a couple of hours or whatever, I responded and she felt like she had been heard. And so she flew, worked on a proposal. She flew out to Silicon Valley, which is next to Stanford, where she's now a student, and she gives a presentation, and the hijab emoji is on your phone now. And I would say I have never seen so much global attention on the fact that this proposal was being done by a 15-year-old girl. And so she actually made it into a time Time magazine like notable teens, I think in 2017. So it's really great to see like that entire journey that take place, because she feels like she's giving voice to the 500 or half a billion, hijabi on the planet. So that's one. And then with the mate emoji, this is a group of kind of Buenos Aires, but people from Buenos Aires that I know from, or I've met in some of my journalism conferences down there. And so what happened was I actually just gave a presentation like, where do emoji come from, at this journalism conference. And like in the audience, there were a bunch of people who were like, we must get mate emoji, because like that is our national pride and treasure. And that one is actually, I have to admit, the mate emoji is actually a tricky one, because it's really, really important to in Argentina, in some other countries sort of in the surrounding area. And then like, it's also seen in the Middle East in certain places, but like in terms of national identity, it's really Argentina. But it's tricky because it's not, while it's very singularly important to one country, it's not necessarily globally recognized. And so when you're trying to get something past your Unicode consortium, you want to show sort of like global demand, or that it has like lots of secondary meaning. So, I didn't know that one was going to get through, I'll be honest. And then they kind of did their proposal, submitted it, and they also flew to Silicon Valley to give the presentation. And I have to say, it was dicey there, because the people in the Unicode consortium tend to, they're older, they're more they're mostly American, they're mostly kind of older engineers, and then they mostly have worked for like large tech companies, whether or not it's Google or Apple or IBM or Microsoft or Facebook. So not all of them necessarily have a really global visual vocabulary. So I remember someone asking in a meeting, like, why can't this just be represented with a cup and a straw? And I was like I actually was speechless for a second there. So anyway, that one actually you see is also on your phone. And the third proposal, which is sort of interesting, is we see constantly this idea of people trying to give proposals to represent menstruation. We've seen this idea of like someone trying to represent PMS, someone trying to represent tampons, someone trying to represent feeling bloated, and then this idea of sort of like bloody underwear. And so this nonprofit organization, which is a girls advocacy group out of the UK, really felt like it was important to try to say menstruation through emoji. And they kind of went through a bunch of different proposals. There was one that looked like a uterus, except that it kind of also looked like a goat's head. And that one, we went back and forth. I mean, we sympathized with them, but the bloody underwear is just like a terrible emoji for all kinds of reasons. Like one, it's not atomic. Two, like bloody underwear is not already an iconic kind of representation that's used in a visual shorthand anywhere. So we kind of helped them go back and forth. And then there was another very well kind of versed emoji writer who works for the UK's National Health Services, who helped them kind of reinvent the proposal. And eventually what has happened, it is blood drop, which is now on your phone. So the idea that you can convey like period, maybe like with moon blood drop, or maybe calendar blood drop. I mean, before the period emoji or the blood drop emoji came, I used to ask people all the time like what they use to symbolize the fact they had their period. So there was one of them used like the rose with the falling petal. Someone used a wine glass as a way to symbolize their period. But my favorite was actually the Japanese flag as a way to symbolize that they had gotten their they were menstruating. So those are sort of the three, the three main arcs, and then we actually go into a whole section on the at the end where we talk to like all these really passionate people who had tried to get emoji through, whether or not it's like the marijuana leaf and the lobster. There was a guy who really felt like onion and garlic were missing, so he's speaking on behalf of the allium family. And then the anglerfish. So it's so interesting to see the voice of the people like articulate their desire to see these tiny little pictures on phones all over the world, right? Like the mission that they feel and the passion that they feel to see something on the small screen rather than on the big screen is really inspiring.
But it's interesting because somebody in the movie talks about the fact that maybe, because people are saying the system might crash under its own weight with like all these thousands of emojis. And somebody's saying, why don't we get rid of the ones that we never use? Like deaccessioning is something that we do at the museums, aerial tramway, So sometimes one wonders why not cleaning up house a little bit anyway. But
yeah. So, I mean, I didn't know you guys do accession things. That's interesting. So from the Unicode perspective, once an emoji, always an emoji. Like once you're encoded in some ways, you can't get unencoded because it'd be like kicking out the capital letter B from the alphabet, right? Because it would impact all of the other everything that had been written that used that character already. That being said, you'll see some like subtle things in an emoji. So I'll give you 3 examples. So one, the gun emoji used to look like a gun. There were a bunch of court cases, homicide court cases, actually, where like the use of the gun emoji in an escalation was brought into evidence. And you could debate, but there's probably like a handful of deaths that were kind of caused by the use of the gun emoji. So Apple, because of this or for other reasons, switched that into now like a water pistol. So the gun emoji is now a water pistol, and that actually impacts not only just the ones going forward, but all the ones going back. So that's one. Another change that you guys might have seen is there used to, there for a long time, no one paid attention to the poor little mask emoji. There was a little yellow face with a mask. It was very Japanese. Americans completely ignored it because like, what is that? But clearly now it's, as of 2020, it's very, very newly relevant. And so you just kind of look sad and a little bit sick. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the mask emoji now is like a smiling mask, and like behind it's actually the smiley face with the mask on top of it. So they kind of reframed it in a more like, I guess, like mask positive way. And then there's another change that's coming, which is that the syringe emoji historically is like kind of has to do with like blood donation, and you see like blood drops kind of falling. And as of this year, Apple, and I think all the other ones are going to, but Apple is the one that just announced it as of this week, actually, that it's now going to be a bloodless syringe. It's just a clean syringe, and the idea then is that it could be used for vaccines. I mean, this idea to encourage people to get vaccines, or just to sort of like use it as a little icon, a curated visual icon that is like easily accessible on your keyboard. So you will see the idea of like sometimes emoji evolving as the picture, but the underlying ones and zeros that tell you like, oh, this is a syringe, or this is a yellow face with a mask. Those things cannot get kicked out, if that makes sense.
Okay, nothing is forever. So to that statement that once coded, always coded, I respond with that one of the latest emojis.
Oh, yes.
Give me a break.
We worked on that.
I know. I wish that I could take credit for it as an Italian, but no, it's not me. I can do some other ones in case, but anyway.
Yeah, we would have invited you. That was amazing. That was hard. This one was really hard to get through.
When I read the description, they were saying pinched hand, the Italian pinched hand. I'm like, what the hell is a pinched hand? Anyway.
It was really hard because, one of the ways that you prove there is demand for something to the Unicode consortium, just because they're engineers, so they love statistics and they love counting things. So you show how many times that phrase appears in Google searches, right? Like, so our average kind of median emoji right now is elephant, which gets about 500 million for 500 million searches on Google. And so you have to show things like, hijab shows up this many times, or like mate, which is a little bit tricky because, it also says mate shows up this many times, or like, llama sort of, or fruits, different things. And then there's no phrase, like, we're like Italian hand gesture, right? Like it's not it doesn't capture itself into these neat little phrases. So it had terrible statistics. And as a result, we really had to kind of fight to emphasize how global it was, and that, it was sort of a big Mediterranean thing. We had all these videos and, screenshots of videos and other kinds of like cultural evidence that this was something that was very iconic.
We're
And
just thankful you're there. No, go ahead, Paul.
and I just think that's such a perfect summation of what art and design can do. It's often, I think of art picking up where language starts to fail, right? When there is no word for something, that's when a picture can fill that gap and fill that thing. So even in Italian, that there's not a word for this, because you don't need one, right? It exists as a gesture. It's not a sort of lingual thing instead. I find that fascinating.
Actually, there's a great artist designer, Bruno Munari, that published this little booklet that is the Dictionary of Italian Language Gestures.
Yeah.
I should get it for you, Jenny. It's right up your alley.
Oh.
Photography of gestures and what they mean. So talking about this, where language picks up, people talk about emojis being language, and there's a big part of the movie where linguists discuss whether it's a language or not. But I would like to ask you, Paul, you've become so intimate with the first set of 176 emojis, and then you have a kid. And I would like to ask you, how do you build that bridge? So how does August use emojis? And what do you think when you look at him using emojis?
So my son, who's now 9 years old, has been using emojis since he was very young. And he's a maximalist. He believes in the philosophy of more is more, which is to say that there's a scene in the film where there's a little girl just doing a sequence of picture after picture after picture after picture, and doesn't feel the need to augment it with any text. And August and his friend, especially now in the age of remote schooling, have become they're communicating with each other on Zoom and chatting all of the time. And they'll have entire long multi-threaded conversations solely of emoji with no supporting text. And I find that really fascinating because to me, I see emoji as an adjunct to text, but to my son, and he'll understand exactly what his friend is trying to say through emoji. And so it's fascinating to me to see that immediate kind of generational difference in how emoji are used. But he, of course, is a big fan of the poop emoji and the cats. We've got cats, and what you would think a little boy might use.
My God, in the trailer
That's
for the movie, there's that boy saying that he likes the poop emoji. I just die of laughter. But also there's Brooklyn Queen. So there's this little girl from Detroit that is actually chastising her mother for using too many emojis instead, right? So there's a whole code about how to be cool and how not to be cool. It's truly fascinating.
Yeah, naturally. I think there is an article that just broke this week that, so two facts. So one is the Face with Tears of Joy, which one was Oxford Dictionary's 2015 word of the year, is actually 9.9% of all emoji, according to the Unicode compiled statistics, is that one character. So about 1 out of every 10 characters sent is this face with tears of joy, which is strange, very strange to me, but it's fairly consistent across all the platforms. Some a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but it comes to that number. But there was an article that said, I guess Gen Z think that's not cool. You're so millennial. It's only older people who use that. And instead they use the crying one or whatever. But it's this idea using that as the equivalent of saying groovy, in the 1980s. You're a generation kind of out of date. So I think it's really impressive to see how it evolves, which is sort of I would never use that emoji. My mom uses that emoji, right? So the sort of judginess that comes because a certain demographic that you define yourself in opposition to is doing something, whether or not it's through clothing or language or emoji, they are evolving away from that. And so it's also really fascinating to hear about your son, because one, there's a whole generation of kids, this first generation are learning to read and write emoji before they can read and write their native language. So you can send a whole thing to grandma, using flowers and unicorns and rainbows and what I did today. And then, there's a linguist in the film who basically observed that usually in the first generational language, you have pidgin, which is people are kind of cobbling things together. And then there's the next generation that creates Creole, which is grammatically sort of coherent and maybe based on sort of the intuitions that we have as humans for communicating with language.
Well, now it's become almost like asking what's your zodiac sign. But Jenny, what's your emoji? What's the one
Yeah.
you use?
So I'm going to say two. So what usually my favorite emoji, if people ask me, I always have to say dumpling because it was my first. It was my first proposal out of, we've done probably maybe 100 proposals through the Unicode consortium. Sorry, 100 proposals. We've gotten 100 proposals, give or take, through the Unicode consortium as Emoji Nation. But that was like my first and the one that kind of led me down this rabbit hole. But from in terms of one that I personally worked on that like really moved people, I have to say the interracial couple emoji, which we worked on with Tinder. So Tinder support. It was a very complex emoji because it wasn't just like, you know, we want a hippopotamus, and you like describe why hippopotamus or hippopotami are really important. We had to come up with a new grammatical structure for emoji because it's two skin tones, right? Everything else into that point was like one skin tone. So you had to kind of show how you could get two different colored things and you glue them together. And, you know, a number of my friends, and particularly the one that worked on the blood drop emoji, a woman named Melissa, she's a Black New Yorker, now in the UK, married to a man who's from India. And when she saw the emoji that could represent them, she said she cried because she felt really seen in a way that sometimes she isn't seen. Like that kind of love isn't necessarily represented very commonly on the big screen, right? Like in movies or in television or whatnot, but she can be represented on the small screen. And in some ways we interact with the small screen more than the big screen on a day-to-day basis. And like, it was just very moving. And to know that you can create something into the world that causes other people to cry is like an incredible feeling to know that.
Very true. And what's the one that you use the most?
Oh, I wouldn't say most, but what I probably over-index to relative to other humans is there's an emoji of like a person in bed, which is like just like a little bed, and it's like that. And so I will send that to people when I'm feeling, you know, like the spirit. You know, it's definitely 2020 and definitely a lot in the last 4 years in terms of the kind of chaos. I would send that when I was like exhausted in bed, and to me that's sort of an iconic one.
How about you, Paul? What's the one you use the most?
So it's changed, but Google used to have their blob emoji, their infamous kind of very specifically designed blobby kind of emoji, and I loved those. I know they got a lot of hate, but they're my favorite emoji design that's ever been. And they had the best one of the emoji with the swirling eyes of disaster and confusion. I love that emoji.
Well, mine is the surfing girl. I surf. Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna be a little less selfish and start asking some questions that we got from the audience. And there's one that is a question that I'm quite sure that you get rather often, Jenny, and you need to like carry the flag. So are we regressing as human beings by utilizing the emoji language? Can we really talk about complex emotions with, and then there's an emoticons, but yeah.
Yeah, so I've thought about this obviously since we did a whole documentary on it. So one thing that I would like to say is that in a way, emoji are our first natively digital form of communication, if that makes sense. So like, obviously we text, you know, we type and all that, but texting and typing is just the digital equivalent of something that already happened in print, which itself is sort of like the written equivalent of something that we spoke. So like human language with a little bit of morphing becomes written language, and then that written language becomes just like what we're kind of sending over now, just in ones and zeros. But what's really interesting about emoji is that it only can really exist because we now have touch interface. And I can look at something and I go, boop, like it's way too hard for me to draw, like the smiling, the space with like 3 hearts, or it's really hard for me to do like the nail polish one. But the fact that suddenly we have these like touch devices and we can scroll through them and go this, and then we can send, is native to having digital devices which have color fonts and like these huge libraries, and the fact that we can switch back and forth and we can send them. And I think that's really notable in part because we've compared emoji to Chinese characters. It's actually really interesting how many Chinese characters have emoji analogs, whether or not it's fire or tree or rock, or actually not rock, mountain, I would say, water, moon, woman. One of the ones that's really interesting that exists in both places very counterintuitively is the pig snout. So there's a lot of parallels between like the the sort of written kind of drawn things in ancient Chinese that evolved in modern Chinese, and also which emoji exists, because it tells you that those things are very elemental to the human experience. So I think in some ways you would think of emoji as the next generation of communication, because like it's really hard. I don't know if you guys tried like typing emoji on your keyboard. Like you either have to do this weird like pick, you know, on the Mac, it's, I don't even know, it's Control Command, I think spacebar, then it picks up a picker, and then you have to. It's very annoying, right? So it's the phone and the other kind of touch devices that lets us do that. The second idea of whether or not, you know, can we communicate with these things, or are we regressing? In fact, one of the wonderful things about emoji is the fact that there isn't a formal definition, and there isn't necessarily a locked like text that matches it. But part of it is you're trying to send an emoji because you can't send the words. And actually, one of the best examples of that is there is sort of an upside down smiley face emoji. And I think to mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And if you ever like type that emoji into Google, like the autofills are like, what does it mean when a guy sends me the upside, what is, and then it's like, what does it mean when a girl sends me, the upside down emoji? So clearly people are want to know what this upside down smiley face is. And so, and that's, the person who sent it precisely wanted to send it just because they didn't want to like say something in text. So what's beautiful about emoji is precisely the ambiguity of the sender and how that ambiguity kind of gets sent to the receiver. And it gives it a sort of space, a sort of range of interpretation. And that range is sort of a delicate dance, I'd say.
In other words, we're not regressing.
We're not regressing. No, which is the future.
So here's a question for Paul. So has the acquisition of the emojis sparked an internal conversation on what it means to acquire coding and other languages?
Yeah. I'd love to know that. I was very curious, actually.
I mean, the languages is the harder part. Because design itself is kind of a language. But it has definitely been part of a larger conversation and kind of struggle that we've been having with what it means to acquire code, what it means to acquire born digital works. Because, as a museum, we've very much kind of embraced the idea of the art of our time. And with design, an enormous amount of the art of our time is born digital works, whether that's websites or video games or graphic design. You can go on and on and on. And emoji exist within that continuum and present many of the same challenges and problems. And I would say that the core one that we still kind of struggle with is that code and this kind of digital design is mutable. So how it behaved in 1999 is not how it's going to behave now. And software environments change really, really rapidly. And it's been something, so I would say we've been thinking about how to take care of emoji in the same way that we've been grappling with the problem of how to take care of apps. We have some apps in our collection. We have video games, we have digital fonts, and all of them present various challenges and kind of, in some cases, very philosophical questions of what does it mean for us to take care of this thing. That is still, I think, very much an emerging discipline. When I started working here with Paola, there was no media conservator at this museum. And now we have, what, 3 or 4? We have, I think, 4, Paola. And whose job is to keep things like this alive. So it's absolutely, emoji has been a big part of this discussion of what does it mean? How are we stewards of these things to make sure that the future public has access to them?
And a philosophical discussion on what design is truly, because so many people, it's interesting, the moment you start talking about it, people become almost entrenched. No, design is furniture. If you don't talk about it and just make it happen, people just like go with the flow. And I have to say the installation of the emojis went also with the MoMA collection to the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris and to the National Gallery Victoria in Melbourne, right? So together with all the Matisses and the Picassos, and off it went. So it's interesting to have that kind of opportunity. So I wanted to ask something else to Jenny, because there's a very cantankerous individual in the movie. It's Mike.
Oh, I love him.
Oh?
Yes.
What?
He's great. He's such a character. He like,
oh my God,
gives us kind of some spice. Great emoji drama.
about Mike, right? Michael Everson. Yeah,
Yeah.
From Dundee, Scotland. He's just so cantankerous. So is he the thorn in the side of Unicode? Because he's part of Unicode. So is he there to drive everybody crazy?
I think Unicode, like the people who get attracted to Unicode, there's a cast of quirky characters that are in the Unicode universe. I mean, I consider myself among them. He is wonderful and also among them. He definitely has very strong opinions, and you know, it's interesting, just to give you some context about why there's sometimes drama. Is there's a Unicode consortium, which is what we feature in the documentary, which is dominated and kind of started by mostly Silicon Valley tech companies. And they started in part because they did not think that the International Standards Organization, which is like dominated by governments, were like, they didn't trust the governments to standardize like text encoding in actually a way that made sense for computers. So when we talk about Unicode, it actually has to get the approval also of the International Standards Organization. Both organizations have to pass the approved emoji for that year. And so Michael and there's a whole little crew are at the International Standards Organization, and they'll often push back on something or introduce things. Like they are the ones who introduced the middle finger emoji, you know, which is not something that would have come from the Unicode side, not from tech companies. The other one that he did was the sort of Vulcan one, which is a little bit weird and probably wouldn't have come through Unicode because it's a little bit too associated with Star Trek, obviously. But the other ones they pushed through are dodo emoji and mammoth. They really wanted these extinct animals. And, you know, like, I think he makes for good news. And in some ways, I love the personalities and the sort of like, you know, they've known each other for decades. They kind of know like how to manage each other's personalities. And you see these kind of like old time rivalries like flare up suddenly randomly. And if you're not, you know, well aware of all the back history, you're very puzzled by some of the tension. But in some ways, it's great that there's so many people that care about these little characters that, you know, pass into text encoding.
So there's another question that either of you can answer with different experiences. So one of our members asks, couldn't emojis be used also as AAC, so augmented and alternative communication for people, especially children who have difficulty with expressive language?
Yes. So I personally think there is a lot of, I guess I would say like a mix of both medical and clinical uses for emoji. I've had some conversations, so this is sort of answering what I know, which is a little bit more in a medical context. So there are, sometimes you go to the doctor and they're like, how bad was the pain? You have like pick like one of the smiley faces. So those systems are often licensed, like the hospital or, you know, doctor's office is paying like anywhere from $500 to like $5,000 a year just to use this like copyrighted system. So we were talking to doctors who felt like you could use emoji, which are sort of more of an open standard, to have to sort of show patients or children, you know, before they're completely verbal, so that they can describe like how they feel, in part because then there wouldn't necessarily be a licensing fee. So there are conversations happening there, which is, can you use it as a way to engage people who are either, you know, not speaking or not comfortable speaking, or like too young to sort of speak completely articulately about how they're feeling. Like, the emoji are sort of a very nice way to express and capture emotion. And then in a different conversation, less mature, there was this idea of like, can you use it as a way for kids who have trouble being more expressive, communicate how they're feeling? And I think that's coming down the pipeline somewhere. It just has to be a matter of the like a system becoming big and standard enough, and then two, enough, what do you call it, research? Like, you have to publish a lot of papers before people will use it in a sort of like a doctors or therapist kind of setting. You have to show that it is robust and it's doing what you claim it to be doing.
And it's interesting because that's, it's a platform, and it's also what we've seen with video games, right, Paul, that they can be used in many different ways.
And I think that just goes back to, Shigetaka Kurita's kind of bemusement at what the world has done with these things that he had no idea they would do with. And we've seen this with video games. Some incredible art is being made with video games, like that guy who would just go into Minecraft and walk, like the British artist Richard Long used to do, just like make these long walks as a kind of performance art piece. And this kind of stuff is happening within video games. And we've seen some pretty fascinating stuff with artists using emoji, with people reinterpreting them and using them in ways that nobody intended them to be used. It's magical to watch, I think.
So another question, Jenny, are you using, or you or anybody in the Unicode, are you using AI in the development of emojis, either through nudging or through data analytics?
So there's a lot of AI that involves emoji, not necessarily on the creation side. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one, there's a lot of research that tries to associate the use of emoji and the text, usually grabbed from Twitter, from what I've seen. And they just like process all of these emoji and basically try to discern what does an emoji mean based on how often people use it in what context. So, that they know different things like, certain emoji means joy, certain emoji means, sorrow, but a very interesting example of AI kind of going slightly haywire on these in terms of analyzing emoji, as she broke last week. It's a news story from BuzzFeed about on Instagram. If you go into, I think, the stories mode or something, if you type in the word dog, you will get a bunch of the dog emoji. So there's little puppy and there's another, the other dog that's sort of full body. But the weird thing is you also showed a Chinese takeout box. So the sort of weird implication is is someone implying the dog a Chinese food, which, obviously is this concept that goes back, in terms of Asian American, stereotypical portrayal over the past couple of decades. And so they broke the story. It was very embarrassing for Instagram for obvious reasons. It was actually an internal person that raised it in an employee chat board that then got leaked to reporters. And so it turns out the next day or the same day, the head of Instagram says the reason the dog thing came was because doggy bag, which is our slang for leftovers, is a phrase that's associated with the takeout container. So as a result, doggy bag in the takeout container then gets kind of associated with the word dog. So she shows you all the strange ways that AI and emoji can mix. Yeah, so I can go to, there's not really,
AI or human stupidity. I want to liberate the plant. I want to liberate it. No, listen, it's my favorite vegetable. I can't stand the fact that I cannot use it. You know what I'm saying? Let's liberate the eggplant.
That could be misconstrued.
No, I'm saying it very, very, very naively and very purely. Anyway. Paul, I want to give you a question to Jenny, because I'm sure you have it, and otherwise it's all from the outside.
Yeah, I guess I had one question, which is just what, Jenny, I know, is a journalist, and journalists are naturally really weirdly curious people. And for those that don't know, she had also worked on a film about the kind of search for General Tso's chicken and the kind of history of Chinese food in America. And I can't tell, is it just you're interested in odd subjects, or what got you into emoji in the first place?
Yeah, I think so. It was in a way that Chinese food documentary, The Search for General Tso, is what led me to an emoji documentary. So I've produced 2 documentaries, one on Chinese food in America called The Search for General Tso, which is I think now on Hulu. It mysteriously pops up even though our distributor doesn't tell us, we suddenly get like a Google alert on it, and you're like, oh, I guess it's on Hulu now. And the other one is on emoji. And these are both projects that I personally have worked on very passionately. So one, in terms of the Chinese food documentary, it's drawn from a book that I did called The Fortune Cookie Chronicles. And then it was when I started down this, emoji rabbit hole, when I was like, oh my God, the Unicode Consortium is like such a bizarre, culture. And like, I can't believe this entire like global visual language is like controlled by this choke point of like a handful of, large Silicon Valley companies, plus Microsoft, which is technically a little bit out of Silicon Valley. And I as soon as I realized how weird this was, I texted the director, Ian Chaney, from the documentary on Chinese food. And I was like, hey, what do you think of emoji? Do you think there's a documentary on emoji? And I especially was like, I don't know, right? Because it wasn't obvious necessarily how you would do it, right? Because they're small and whatever, and we weren't allowed to go film inside the Unicode Consortium. So we were just really lucky, maybe like 6 months, 7 months later, when Ray Youth's application came across the Unicode like inbox, and I was, as soon, it didn't say anything about her, it didn't have her bio or anything, and so I wrote back to her and I was like, tell me about yourself. Like, for all I know, she could have been a grandma or she could have been, professor or something. And she's like, I'm a 15-year-old girl, Saudi Arabian girl who lives in Berlin. And I was like, yes, you are the person. Like, one, because you'll get the emoji through, and then two, it's she would be a great character for the documentary.
And she was.
Yeah, definitely. They were all fabulous character. I don't even know which one was my favorite. Maybe Brooklyn Queen, but
yeah,
I mean, Brooklyn, 13-year-old that just with the best nails, best manicure in the world, and she wrote and performed this emoji song. Send me an emoji that is just like completely drills in your head forever. So, well. This was a fabulous, fabulous night. Before I say goodbye to everyone, I would like to also thank on the keyboards, our AV crew, Howard Deitch, Evelyn Emily, Stephen Warrington, and also Ellie Levitt, and first and foremost, Harper Jean, who organized the whole evening. And this was really a great pleasure. I want to thank you, Jennifer and Paul, so much for this conversation and for giving us all a deeper understanding of the origins and the future of emojis. And again, we'll drop a link in the chat for you all to the Emoji Story documentary, which is now streaming on MoMA Magazine. Totally worth your time, and it's heaps of fun. Thank you so much, members, for tuning in with us tonight. And please be on the lookout in your inboxes for future event. And, this is an experimental event for us, and we would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So fill in the survey that we dropped in the chat, please. I love you, Jenny, so much.
Thank you.
I love you, Paul. I just hope we'll be together. Yes, hearts. We'll be together soon. Thank you and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.